Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. Today is our fifth craft and our fifth ornament in our fisherman-themed Christmas tree. If you've missed any of the others, I can include the playlist up there and in the description. So I'm really excited about today's craft. We're going to make a little fishing shack for our tree. Let's go have some fun.
I love miniature building, so I thought it would be really fun to have a miniature seaside building for our fisherman tree. And I looked at so many images. It was so hard to choose. But when I saw this one, which is called Motif Number 1, and it's in Rockport, Massachusetts, I just had to create this one. It has the little buoys on the side, and it has that wonderful pier around it. And I just thought that would be a lot of fun to make. And I'm going to recreate this with cardboard. So what I have here is some thin corrugated cardboard, because I thought for such a tiny object that thin cardboard would be easier to work with. So this is some cardboard that a toner cartridge came in, and it just happens to be very thin. It's not like an Amazon box. And then I'm also using what I call kitchen cardboard. It's a box from a box of granola bars, and that's going to be for the shingles for the roof. So I made a little pattern for myself. I'm not going to make the entire Motif Number 1 building. This is just based on that building. So what I'm going to make is just sort of the tall part of the building, but I'm going to put the buoys on the tall part of the building. And so I'm going to have like a little pointy roof. So it's an 8 centimeter tall from the bottom of the building to the top of the roof, and 4 centimeters across. And then the distance from the top of the building, the flat part of the building, to the pointy part of the roof is 2.5 centimeters. So the rectangle part is 5.5 centimeters high by 4 centimeters wide, and then it's got another 2.5 centimeters on the top, on the front and the back, which is the pointy roof. And you can see that in my little model here. And now the two roof pieces are 4.5 centimeters by 3.5 centimeters, and the reason they're sized like that is because they will overhang a little bit. And so the first step is just to cut all of that out of the thin corrugated cardboard, and I just used my box cutter knife, and I used a ruler so that my lines would be nice and straight. On the inside of the box, I just scored where the lines were on the original drawing, so where the corners of the walls are on the building, so that it would be easy to fold. Now I want to cut the little window that's on the building in the reference photo. And I want to say that if I were making this again, I would cut the window and the door on the same side, because what I did was I put the window on one side and the door on the other side, so like one's in the front and one's in the back. And then I put all of the buoys with the door. And I wish that I had both the door and the window on the same side with the buoys, because you can't see the back of the building because it's facing the middle of the tree. So I basically just sketched on where I thought a window would be. I mean, I measured a little bit to make sure it would be in the middle. And I did the same with the door. I didn't want the door in the middle, so the door is on the left side of the other building face. And then I just cut those out with my box cutter. And now actually I haven't cut the door out yet, but I'm going to eventually cut it out and put a door sort of behind it so that it has some texture to it, some depth. So, you could do that step now. Now I thought that this would look a lot more realistic and authentic if I tried to make little roof tiles for it. I hadn't done that when I did the Big Thunder building, the saloon, and I regretted the way that one looked, the way they were painted on. I didn't paint them very well. So I thought, let's try to make some roof tiles for this one, or some roof shingles. So this is my thin cardboard box. This is my granola bar box, and I am cutting 1/4 inch strips out of the granola bar box using my box cutter knife and the ruler as a guide. And then I'm going to cut shingles by cutting pieces of those strips, but I'm going to vary the size of the shingles because real cedar shingles, at least old-timey ones, are not all the same size. So I varied them from quite thin to a little bit thick. And then I took one of my roof pieces and my hot glue gun and my tweezers, and I just put those little shingles on one row at a time. So starting at the bottom, trying to alternate them, you know, so that the seams aren't in the same place, but also sort of varying the sizes. So that's the first way I did this, and it turned out fine. And by the way, I just went to the top until the whole thing was covered, because when I put it together, I'm going to put like a little ridge vent on the top, or I don't know technically what that's called, if it was a ridge vent in those days, or the thing that goes over a ridge vent. Anyway, we'll finish off the top later. So the shingles just need to cover the side. And now I just wanted to show you the second way I tried to do that was with Mod Podge. And I thought that this was actually a little bit easier than the hot glue. And of course white glue would work just fine. I just happened to have Mod Podge handy. So I would just paint a little bit of Mod Podge onto the roof and then put my shingles down. And for some reason, the first few shingles were a little bit difficult. They sort of slipped around. But once I got started, it got easier to put the shingles on. And then I would just paint a little more Mod Podge at the top of those shingles where they're going to overlap, and then put the next row down. And I think this just went quicker because I wasn't worried about the hot glue cooling before I got the shingles on. So I could do a whole row at a time instead of just a little bit of a row like I did with the hot glue. Okay, so that done, you'll notice that motif number 1 has batting, I guess is the only thing I can think of to call it, or maybe it's made up of vertical boards on the outside. I'm not sure, but I wanted to give it that same sort of vertical look without trying to put little vertical boards on my little cardboard model, because I just didn't think I would be able to put anything on that was thin enough that looked right. So because it's corrugated, I thought, well, I'll press into the corrugations with a ruler, and that will give me a little bit of texture. So I did do that. I pressed down with my metal ruler, and the texture did come out a little bit more. So then I wanted to put some trim around the window, and I thought maybe I would use a bamboo skewer, but it was really too thick. So what I ended up using was this very thin dowel, and it is actually about the width of a toothpick. So if you don't have a dowel that's about the diameter or width of a toothpick, then I think a toothpick would work just fine. But what I did was I split it down the middle, and then I split it again. So I cut it into 4 pieces, and that was the size piece that I used for trim around the window. And then I just sort of measured it to the window and cut it and glued it down with hot glue. The tweezers were definitely my friend, and my little tiny needle nose pliers with this project. So with the door, you can see I did eventually decide to cut the door out and also put some of that same extremely thin trim around the door. And I used a combination of my little saw, my tiny little model saw with the miter box, and my knife. Once I sort of got a slice in it that was in the right place, it split apart pretty easily with my knife, so I didn't have to cut all the way through it with the saw. And then once I had trimmed out the door, I just cut a piece of the kitchen cardboard and glued that behind the door. And then I glued my box together again with the hot glue. Now I don't want to glue the roof on yet because I'm going to be painting this, and I think it'll be easier to paint before I put the roof on. And now to paint, which is always so satisfying and fun, but it also makes me very nervous because I am not a very skilled painter and I'm not that good at picking colors. But I'm going to try to match the colors of motif number 1, which is sort of a dark red, and thank goodness paint it all over in that same dark red so I don't have to try to paint those tiny pieces of trim a different color. So I have this Craft Smart Tuscan red, but before I do that, I do want to emphasize those corrugations in the cardboard. So I don't think the corrugations are going to be enough to communicate that sort of texture of the outside of the original building. So I started by using some black acrylic paint and a toothpick because I really don't have a brush thin enough to paint these little lines on. But that was really a very frustrating struggle. After I did one side, I just got a pen and I used a pen to draw those lines on. But then once I had the lines drawn on with a pen, I went over them as best I could with the paint. And even though the paint is a little bit globby and it doesn't look all that great by itself, once the red paint is over it, it actually looks pretty decent. So the red paint is that Craftsmart Tuscan red mixed with my favorite burnt umber, and that gave me the brown color that I was looking for. And it just took a couple of coats, like one coat all over, but then I really had to go back and do some touch-ups, just little spots that I had missed. I wanted to make sure the whole thing was completely covered with the red paint. Now for the buoys, they are so tiny. So what I decided to do was to try to make them out of pieces of toothpick. And I did also try to use a piece of a larger dowel, and I cut that into 4 pieces. So I bisected it and then bisected it again. And I did end up using one of those, but I do think it really was a little too big. So I just cut various lengths of the toothpick. And because the toothpick is pointy at one end, I thought that would be a good shape for a buoy, because some buoys or many buoys are tapered at one end. If you look at motif number 1, a lot of them aren't tapered, but of course some of them are. So I just cut off the very pointy tip, but I left some of the taper. So I have a few tapered buoys, and then I have just cylindrical buoys. I don't have any rectangular buoys. There are some on motif number 1. And a few days after I made this model, my stove wouldn't light, and so I lit it with a match. And I looked at the matchstick and I thought, oh, why didn't I think to use matchsticks for this? Because they are not round, and I might have been able to cut them to give myself little sort of rectangular shaped buoys. But I think that in the end this worked fine, and it's the painting that I think really makes this work. And so I just used a variety of colors: yellow, orange, red, a couple of different blues, green, white, to try to mimic the buoys that were on the building. I did little stripes, and if you just paint the little toothpick pieces with a toothpick, and if you're patient, paint one color, let it dry, then paint another color, and really try to get authentic looking buoys, then I think that the colors will really sell these as buoys, especially if there's a lot of variety. And for the window, if you look at the picture of motif number 1, at least the one that I have, if you can't really see through the window, it looks black. So what I decided to do was take a piece of the granola bar box that I would be able to glue inside the box behind the window, and I painted that black. And then I drew on the window and the mullions with a pencil, and then just went over that with the red color that I used to paint the building, and then glued that inside the little building model behind the window, so that that's what you see through the window. And I really liked the way that looked. So again, I really wish I had put that on the front of the building. Now I've gotten out some black florist's wire, which I got at Dollar Tree. I am not going to use it. I got it out to illustrate that if you want to make this a hanging ornament, this is probably the time where you would want to attach some sort of hanger before you put the roof on. And maybe you would put it so that it comes up in the middle of the roof. Now I just used hot glue to glue the roof on, and then it was time to make that little ridge vent to cover up the seam in the top of the roof. So I just cut another strip of the granola bar box that would fit on there, and then I just glued that so that it, looked like sort of the last shingle on the top there. Now for painting that, I just wanted to be careful when I was painting it that I wouldn't get any paint on the building. And I'm starting with a gray color apple barrel granite. And I should have painted the roof before I put it on, because the first thing I did was paint the underside where it meets the building, and obviously that would have been a lot easier before I put it on. So the building in my reference photo, the roof is quite light, so I thought the granite gray was a good starter color. And then what I did was once that had dried, I took my burnt umber and dry brushed that over. and then I mixed water with my burnt umber, and I wanted to try to get the look of, sort of marks from rain. You know how roofs will, they look worn from where water has run down them. But I think that my model is just too small for this method to have worked, where I tried to drip water down. So I ended up just sort of painting the watered down paint over it to give it sort of a drippy look. And then it's time to attach the buoys. Now I thought about putting them on the side. Well, I guess it's time to finish painting them. I guess I hadn't finished painting them, and then attach them. So, okay, now that they're all painted, I just sort of laid them out on the front and moved them around until I thought they looked sufficiently random and sort of similar to what I was seeing on the actual building. It's hard for me to make a random pattern. I think it's generally hard for humans to make a random pattern. But what I noticed is that, some of them were closer to others, so the space between them wasn't uniform. And so I just put them on the front with the door. I'm going to say for the third time, I wish the window were on the front too, but it isn't. The buoys are there. And I didn't end up using all of the ones that I made. I had an idea that I might make more of these buildings. I did make more roofs, but instead of making more of these, I decided to add the pier that it's sitting on. But so once I had them positioned, I just glued them on with hot glue, and again, used my tweezers to position them. Okay, for the pier, I started by taking my building and putting it on a piece of cardboard and figuring out about how big I wanted the pier to be. So about how much space did I want around the building on each side. And it wasn't very much. I didn't want a lot of space around it. That would look weird because it's going to be on a tree. So I just made a box, just bottom, top, and sides. I did put a piece inside the box because I'm just, hot gluing it together. So I just put a piece diagonally inside for that top piece to rest on. And then once I had made that, I decided to cover it in Model Magic. So this is homemade Model Magic. It's what's left over from the sheep project from the Big Thunder Mountain tree. And the homemade Model Magic, or air dry clay, is 2 parts baking soda to 1 part cornstarch and 1 part water. Mix it together, heat it on the stove, keep mixing it until it turns into a dough, and then let it cool and work it. It's quite simple. So unfortunately I was working out of frame for part of this, so I'll cut out those parts. But you can see that I did not cover the bottom, but I covered the top and all of the sides of the box with the air dry clay. And then I used a dowel, or it's about a toothpick sized dowel, to put the stones in. And I thought about 3 rows of stones was what was going to work for this. And then I also put stones on the top. I didn't put any under the building. Now, when you do this, you run the risk of the stones falling off, because you're cutting around them on all sides, basically, where you're pressing in. And you do want to press in a lot. You want those depressions to be fairly deep. Like if you look at that original building, you can see big spaces between the stones. And you can also see that they're all different sizes and shapes. So you definitely want to try to recreate that in your Model Magic or air dry clay. So I did just press all of those rock shapes in. And then I did dry that in the oven, which seemed to work just fine. I put it on a very low temperature. I think 170 is the lowest my oven will go to. And I have a baking sheet that I only use for craft projects, although I don't think that this would really be a problem because I think I don't know if it's edible, but anyway, I put it on my craft project baking sheet in the oven. It is cardboard under there, but it was fine at 170 degrees. Wouldn't put it much higher. And about 20 minutes, and then I let it stay in there while the oven cooled down. And that dried, so that's good. That sped my project up. Now I have these thicker dowels, and again, if you look at that picture of motif number 1, there are some, I guess they're called pilings. They're the round pieces of wood that go down into the water and I assume are, fixed in the ground. So there's some pilings and there's some ladders. So I thought I would like to make a little ladder and have a couple of pilings just on one side of this little pier. So I had some thicker dowel pieces, so I just cut some that looked like they would be a good length for that. And then I used the very thin ones and cut some very tiny pieces and glued together a little ladder. Now that little ladder I ended up throwing away, and I made a new little ladder because that one was just really messy with the hot glue. So when I painted it, all the hot glue got painted and it just looked like a big mess. So I did it again more carefully with just a tiny bit of hot glue holding each piece of the ladder together. I'd say it's probably pretty fragile, but hasn't fallen apart yet. So now for my next step with these stones, I wanted to give them some texture. So the texture of the air dry clay is very smooth and not very stone-like. So I just mixed some baking soda in with the granite colored paint and sort of painted that over, dabbed that over all of the stones. So this is going to be my base color for the stones, but it's also going to give them some good texture, and they really did look a lot better after I gave them that coat of baking soda paint. Now I did the same thing for the wood for the pilings, and you can see the ladder, how terrible it looks. So that is the ladder that gets thrown away, and off camera I did make a new ladder. Same process, but I was just more careful. And I don't think I painted it with baking soda paint. I think I painted it just straight gray. Now I then dry brushed over the rocks and over all of the wood with a darker gray. And now for the parts of the rocks and pilings and ladder that are below the tide line, that's kind of a dingy brown on Motif Number 1. So I watered down my burnt umber paint and painted that over the bottom of all of these things. So I picked a tide line and just was consistent, painted around that and the wood with the brown. And again, that was watered down. And just to be clear, I also painted the bottom because this could be seen on the tree, so I wanted it to be consistent. Now I used a slightly watered down acrylic black paint and I applied it with a toothpick between the rocks. And I also applied it to the top of the pilings and the ladder because there's something around them. I don't know if it's tar or if it's something else. I can't tell, but in the reference photo. So I did paint the top of those. For between the rocks, I think I would have chosen a slightly lighter color. I feel like the black was just a little bit too dark. I'm not sure, but that's the color that I used to paint between the rocks. I would definitely like to see that dulled down a tiny bit. And then I did do a black wash over the entire thing and then blotted it off just because I thought it was a little bit too light. And then I glued it all together. I glued the building down onto the rocks, and I glued the little ladder and the pilings at a little bit of an angle, as they are in the reference photo, to one side of the building. And it's not shown here, but I did Mod Podge the rocks. I did not Mod Podge the building. I was afraid it would change the way it looked, because even the matte Mod Podge has a little bit of a sheen to it, and I really didn't want that. But I did want the rocks protected because they're made of the air dry clay, and I felt like that the paint and the clay itself could just crumble off if I didn't protect them. But of course, if you feel more comfortable Mod Podging everything or using a different sealant, then you definitely should. Here's what it looks like. And on the tree, and on the tree with the lights on. And of course, another choice that you could make here is to cut a little hole in the back so that you could insert a light into the building, and then instead of putting the door and the window in, maybe putting some wax paper or something behind them so that the light could shine through.
So what did you think of our little fishing shack, our little sort of model of motif number 1 from Rockport? I had a lot of fun making it, and I'm really pretty excited about the way it came out. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. That tells me that you like this sort of content and I should bring you more. And if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. I hope to see you for our 6th and final video in this fisherman-themed Christmas tree series. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.